sexy guys do. Explore what soul and their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, I'll be your host this week, and as always I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together we'll explore what's on our minds, and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this week's episode started with a joke that I heard a long time ago, which is that commercial fusion power is 20 years away, and it always will be.
Yeah.
And that joke has stood the test of time because I heard that joke a long time ago, far more than 20 years ago, and we still don't have fusion power, supplying our cities with electricity.
Yep.
And it raises the question. I'm confident that fusion power is a difficult challenge to overcome, and yet it just seems to be the sort of thing that just keeps getting pushed down the road in terms of when it will become available. And so I set you on the task of reading up on this, figured out why it is that fusion power is such a hard problem to solve, and basically answering the question, is it still 20 years away? What did you discover?
Yeah, well, this was a tricky question for me. It took me a longer time than usual to kind of understand the answer before I could kind of frame it into a presentation. And I think that's because this is a science topic. And a lot of us, myself included, haven't studied science in decades.
Sure.
So I think the best way to start is by reminding people what fusion is and how it relates to other forms of energy. So let's start there. All energy comes from basic physical and chemical processes. For most of human history, we produced energy by burning carbon-based materials like wood, coal, and oil. We've also harnessed power from the sun, the wind, and water. There are two physical processes that produce energy from nuclear reactions inside atoms, fission and fusion. Both yield millions of times more energy than all those other sources. Fission happens when a neutron slams into a larger atom, splitting it into two smaller atoms and releasing additional neutrons that can start a chain reaction. Fission is the energy that powered the atomic bombs dropped on Japan to end World War II.
Mm-hmm.
The heavy elements uranium and plutonium are used to create fission reactions in today's nuclear power plants because they're the easiest elements to control. The fission energy heats water into steam that spins a turbine and produces electricity without burning carbon, which is why many people believe that despite their risks, fission-driven nuclear power plants need to be part of our toolkit for addressing climate change.
Yeah.
Now, fusion is the process that has powered stars like our sun for billions of years. It happens in the core of a star when huge amounts of molecular dust collapse under gravity. Two atoms from lighter elements slam together to form a heavier element, like hydrogen isotopes combining to form helium. The fusion of the two atoms releases energy that's several times greater than fission. The hydrogen bombs developed during the Cold War use both fission and fusion to generate explosions that are hundreds to thousands of times more powerful than that of atomic bombs. The initial fission explosion creates the conditions necessary for a fusion reaction to take place, with the resulting fireball reaching temperatures as high as those in the center of the sun. Now, you might think that if we're already creating demonstrable fusion reactions in bombs, how hard can it be to create fusion reactions to generate electricity? The answer is that while it's not terribly difficult to make uncontrolled fusion happen in a thermonuclear weapon, it's much harder to generate a slow, controlled fusion reaction while simultaneously extracting useful energy from it.
Right.
I'm going to try to explain why in some detail. In making this explanation, I'm going to rely heavily on a study published in March of 2023 by the Government Accountability Office, an investigative arm of the U.S. Congress, which analyzed the benefits and limitations of fusion energy, the challenges that might affect its development, and also made policy recommendations for how to overcome those challenges. That GAO report, more than any other single source, informed my understanding of where we are right now regarding fusion energy. I'll post it to our Facebook page for anyone who wants to do a deeper dive. All right. Fusion is extremely difficult to achieve on Earth because of the high temperature and pressure it requires. As you might remember from high school chemistry, every atom has a nucleus that's positively charged and repels other nuclei. To fuse with another atom, nuclei must be moving fast enough to have lots of chances to collide and overcome that electrostatic barrier. For nuclei to move that fast, they must be heated to an insane temperature and either insanely pressurized or confined to a very small space for at least a few seconds. And that's really hard to do. Fusion in the sun takes place at a temperature of about 27 million degrees Fahrenheit and a pressure equal to 100 billion times the Earth's atmospheric pressure at sea level. Such pressure is damn near impossible to recreate on Earth, so fusion experiments compensate by using even higher temperatures, north of 180 million degrees Fahrenheit, just to create the baseline conditions for a fusion reaction.
Yeah.
Generating fusion power anywhere other than inside a star or an H-bomb is both a basic science problem, meaning you have to generate a large-scale, sustainable fusion reaction like the one I just described, and an engineering and technological problem. You have to find a way to contain and control the fusion reaction, then transmit it as energy. Think about this. First, you have to produce a fusion reaction at temperatures hotter than the sun. That's the science problem. To solve it, you need to develop materials that can withstand the conditions present in a fusion energy system, not just the high heat, but the ion damage from the bombardment of highly energized neutrons that are cast away by the fused atoms. That's the technology problem. Why would we even try to solve problems that difficult? That's a rhetorical question, of course. Because if we're somehow able to harness fusion as a form of energy, it could produce potentially abundant and safe electricity. Global energy use is expected to triple by the year 2100, and fusion would be a game changer in helping us to meet that demand. Fusion energy is carbon-free and doesn't involve combustion, so compared to the burning of fossil fuel, it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Unlike gas and oil reserves, which are finite on Earth, fusion uses relatively small amounts of relatively common materials as its fuel, like deuterium and tritium, which are isotopes of hydrogen and the most likely components of the first fusion energy systems. 1 ton of fusion fuel would produce as much energy as 7 million tons of oil. Compared to renewable energy sources, fusion power plants can be sited almost anywhere because they're not limited by Mother Nature like the availability of sunshine and wind. And last but not least, it's potentially much safer than our current sources of nuclear energy, as it creates far less radioactive waste than fission reactions, nor does it pose a meltdown risk. As that intro suggests, there are many challenges to overcome before we can generate commercial fusion. And by that I mean fusion power beyond a laboratory setting. One challenge concerns the physics of plasmas. At the 9-digit temperatures needed for fusion, the nuclei in atoms separate from their electrons, creating burning plasma, a substance necessary for fusion, but one we don't fully understand and whose turbulent behavior we can't predict. Advances in computer modeling have helped to develop simulations of plasma's behavior under such conditions. But without the benefit of experimentation, we can't be confident about those results. One thing we do know is that no material known to humanity can withstand the extreme conditions in which plasma burns. It would instantly melt even extremely heat-resistant metals like tungsten. Researchers believe there are only a few ways to control heated plasma so fusion can take place: through magnetic confinement, inertial confinement, or some combination of the two. Now, I'm going to explain both now. Magnetic confinement is the more common of the two approaches. It's where the electrically charged plasma is held in place by powerful magnetic fields so it never touches the walls or vaporizes the fusion chamber. The most popular design for magnetic confinement is a vacuum chamber called a tokamak. That's spelled Tokamak. It uses a donut-shaped container inside which strong magnetic fields squeeze the plasma for a sustained period at high pressure until its atoms fuse. While experiments with tokamaks have made progress, they have trouble keeping the turbulent plasma stable, which degrades the walls of the tokamak and imperils the fusion reaction. Further improvements are coming, but they're a mixed bag. In 2021, scientists at MIT developed high-temperature superconducting magnets that might make it easier to build smaller magnetic confinement fusion devices and thus reduce the cost of fusion energy systems. But just to illustrate the challenges that remain, these superconducting magnets require thermal insulation so they can be cooled to cryogenic temperatures below -240 Fahrenheit, as they heat plasma to temperatures hotter than the sun. So think about that discrepancy in temperatures.
Right, yeah. The image that comes to mind is trying to lick an ice cream cone in the middle of a blast furnace.
Yeah, right. So there's an international research consortium currently at work on a new device being built in France called ITER that they hope will be the first magnetic confinement device to achieve break-even energy generation and operate at the scale of a power plant. Unfortunately, it's bogged down in mismanagement and cost overruns, and it won't become operational until the 2040s. Even if it's successful someday, it's not designed to produce commercial power. It's strictly an experimental machine for resolving engineering problems and bridging the way to viable power plants. That means we don't yet know whether tokamaks can withstand the sustained materials degradation necessary to operate a nuclear fusion reactor.
Right. And if I'm correct, it's not just creating a system that can withstand that initial reaction, but withstand like ongoing reactions over the course of years so that you're not constantly replacing your equipment.
That's right. And I'm going to get to that when we're talking about the other challenges, but that's absolutely right. I should have said at the beginning that my explanation in this section of what a fusion reaction is kind of answers your question for you, right? Like you're seeing how unbelievably difficult this is.
Right.
The explanation of fusion kind of answers its own question about why it's so hard to produce.
Yeah.
But let me get to the other way to contain fusion, and it's inertial confinement. And that's where you aim a bunch of high-powered lasers at small targets to compress plasma at high temperature and pressure and make it burn, triggering brief pulses of fusion energy in which the super-hot fusing plasma is held in place by its own inertia before expanding. Though there are fewer facilities doing inertial confinement research, one of them celebrated a monumental breakthrough recently. In December 2022, at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories National Ignition Facility, or NIF, and that's in California, researchers conducted the first controlled fusion experiment ever using inertial confinement to achieve break-even, also known as fusion ignition, in which the fusion reaction becomes self-sustaining, producing a net gain of energy. The experiment worked like this. An array of 192 powerful lasers was trained on a cylinder, heating it to a temperature of 5.4 million degrees Fahrenheit, which vaporized the cylinder and produced a burst of X-rays. The X-rays bombarded a fuel pellet of frozen deuterium and tritium the size of a pencil eraser, causing the hydrogen isotopes to fuse into helium and release more energy than it received from the lasers. This is unquestionably a major milestone that will unlock further breakthroughs in fusion research. But before we get too carried away, keep in mind the following. First, the fusion ignition was sustained for such a short period of time that the net energy gain was the equivalent of what's needed to boil a kettle of water. Second, the lasers we use for such experiments are so energy inefficient that only about 1/100th of their energy made it to the target fuel pellet. When you consider the total amount of energy needed to continuously operate an inertial confinement fusion system so that it someday generates electricity for consumers, we're nowhere close to launching and sustaining industrial-scale nuclear fusion. And third, the NIF is a research lab devoted to nuclear weapons development. It's not a power plant. As yet, there's no plan in place to turn its successful fusion ignition into usable energy. Now I want to digress a little on the history of fusion power, because I think it sets us up for the latter part of this podcast. Scientists have thought of nuclear fusion as the holy grail of sustainable energy generation for nearly 3/4 of a century. And you're right to say the fusion power is something that's been 20 years away for the last 50 years. Enrico Fermi, who led the Manhattan Project that built the first atomic bomb, envisioned generating power with fusion reactors. The U.S. government began funding magnetic confinement fusion research in 1951, and the Atomic Energy Commission started funding laser fusion research in 1963. International collaborative efforts were first established in the 1970s. Between 1983 and 2014, significant research was done to assess the economic, environmental, and safety features around fusion power plant design choices. Right now, NASA is funding private companies trying to design and build compact fusion reactors, perhaps the size of a minivan, that might someday perform tasks like carrying a robotic spacecraft to Saturn in only 2 years, instead of the nearly 7 years it currently takes, or powering rockets used to deflect asteroids that might threaten the Earth, or serving as the energy source for space stations or bases on the Moon or Mars. So that's to point out that this isn't simply about generating electricity from fusion. There are a lot of other potential applications.
Yeah.
I want to say more about the engineering challenge of withstanding fusion reactions. The fusion of deuterium and tritium releases high-energy subatomic particles called neutrons that can damage the materials housing the reactions or even make them radioactive, since tritium is itself slightly radioactive. Facilities in the U.S. and Spain to develop materials that can withstand the neutron barrage are expected to go online in the 2030s. A commercial fusion energy power plant will also need to contain and dispose of low-level radioactivity. The fusion experiments we run today last for only seconds or minutes at a time, and the containment materials currently available to us, when subjected to the extreme stresses generated by fusion plasmas, degrade way too quickly for commercial use.
Yeah.
Whereas A fusion power plant will need to be built from materials that can last a minimum of several months to a year without repair or replacement. And that was your earlier point, Mark.
Yeah.
There's still no facility on Earth where fusion energy can even be tested, let alone produced at scale. Personnel at one national laboratory told GAO researchers that it would take at least 6 years to build a suitable testing facility and another 6 years to get useful data from it. The bottom line here is that without significant engineering advances in developing and testing durable materials, we won't be able to reliably produce commercial electricity via fusion anytime soon. And after we figure that out, as if that isn't hard enough, we then have to tackle the problem of extracting fusion energy and integrating it into our existing power plants in such a way to provide cost-effective electrical power. As the GAO report points out, quote, "For a fusion energy system to be viable, it must produce more energy through fusion reactions than the energy needed to produce and maintain those reactions in a plasma," end quote. In other words, a fusion energy system isn't viable unless and until it can create more power than the entire fusion power plant consumes.
Sure.
We're not there yet. Though fusion generates huge amounts of energy from a small fuel supply, it takes a lot of energy to produce the burning plasma. As the NIF experiment showed, we can produce what scientists call fusion events in the laboratory, but they're nowhere near cost efficient yet. The last major obstacle to fusion energy getting off the ground is what private investors call regulatory uncertainty. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is trying to develop a framework for how best to regulate fusion. Its regulatory process will need to walk the fine line between not inadvertently constraining or inhibiting the emergence of the new technologies crucial to the timely development of a cost-effective pilot plant for fusion energy, while at the same time crafting sufficiently robust regulations to protect the public and assure people that fusion energy projects can be safely sited in their communities. For one thing, the amount of radioactive tritium kept on site at fusion power plants might cause serious harm to plant workers and the surrounding community if it were accidentally released. The NRC can't use fission power plants as models because the risks of fission and fusion are different, nor will fusion be cost competitive if subjected to fission's regulations. One X factor for fusion energy is how its perception by the American public affects its development. To gauge this, the GAO study held focus groups with citizens, and it found everything you might expect. Safety concerns, worries about whether taxpayers will be stuck with an enormous bill, questions about whether it will bring good-paying jobs to their communities, and, as always, NIMBYism about the siting of power plants. Fusion's champions in Congress and the private sector will need to finesse all those issues and get the public on their side if they have any hope of developing and monetizing it.
Yeah.
With minds like steel tracks, more than joy here to the sun. The interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And spring, it's a calling and they do it for you. And spring me, baby, and spring, it's a calling that you don't do it too.
Despite all those obstacles, there is money being invested in the promise of fusion energy, but it's not as much as you might think. Private investors have begun seed funding 8 fusion energy startups to the tune of $4.7 billion as of 2022. While that's not a small sum, it pales in comparison to the money being invested in something like AI. According to industry insiders, that's because private investors expect ROI within 20 years, and that timeline is far from guaranteed for fusion. And I'm going to say more about that, the timeline, at the end. In March 2022, the U.S. Department of Energy announced a public-private partnership to accelerate the development and commercialization of fusion energy. And fiscal year 2022 congressional appropriations steered $713 million to the DOE's Office of Science for its Fusion Energy Sciences program and $580 million to the National Nuclear Security Administration for its Inertial Confinement Fusion program. Also, the Inflation Reduction Act provided a one-time budget appropriation of $280 million for basic science research into fusion. So my point there is there's money being pumped into the system here, but it's not the kind of staggering tens, hundreds of billions of dollars you hear about when you're discussing things like AI.
Sure. Though I think as excited as I would be with a significant development within fusion power, I have to say, based on what you've reported so far, there's not a whole lot of basis for short-term optimism that would justify that sort of spend. Like that money could easily go to waste, just chasing down dead ends. So I can see what the argument would be on the other side of that issue.
Yes, precisely. And I was interested to learn that the ROI universe for a lot of these big investors is 20 years. It kind of makes sense, right? You want to see the fruition of your investment during your own lifetime.
Sure.
Most of these investors are middle-aged already, so it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
The GAO report offered a handful of policy recommendations for how to further develop fusion energy. One was to better align public and private efforts, since government dollars focus more on basic science and less on the practical development of the energy infrastructure that private industry needs to bring fusion energy to the electrical grid. Another is to promote more sharing of research facilities and training programs so that money isn't wasted on parallel efforts to achieve the same goals, especially given the supply shortages of materials like tritium needed for fusion power. Tritium is rare in nature, but it's generated as a normal byproduct of nuclear reactors, so that's how we keep the supply. And then there's the shortage of workers with enough expertise to handle the scientific and engineering challenges posed by fusion, which is a practical impediment to developing fusion power anytime soon. One stakeholder told GAO researchers that it takes 8 years just to train engineers and advanced technicians in fusion energy development, and we will need many more of them to scale up fusion power as a commercial energy source.
That's mind-blowing. That single fact is mind-blowing to me, that it would take 8 years just to train someone in the demands of the job.
Yeah.
Like, that's the amount of time it takes to get a PhD, for context.
Yeah. Well, the old joke about rocket science, right? This is kind of rocket science. This is the hard stuff,
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly hard for us puny humans.
Yeah. So there's one heartening aspect of a transition to fusion. I don't want it to all be doom and gloom. And here's one little bright thing. It's that from a physical plant perspective, fusion reactors are likely to be about the same size as fossil fuel or fission plants, with similar energy outputs of a few gigawatts. That means we can construct them on the same sites as those plants, with the necessary electrical grid infrastructure already in place. If and when they ever get here, fusion plants will probably replace coal plants first, then gradually oil, gas, and fission.
Yeah, not if the Republican Party has anything to say about it.
Yeah.
We'll pry coal plants out of their cold, dead hands.
Well, I have a thought about that I saved for the end, and I would welcome your feedback on that. But I want to finally pivot to your ultimate question about how long this is going to take. According to people in the field, the timeline for fusion energy to overcome all its challenges is measured in decades. many experts think we'll see a commercially viable fusion industry emerging by the 2050s or 2060s. That sounds similar to the predicted timeline for artificial general intelligence, another subject we've spent a lot of time on, Mark, as you know.
Right.
So I'm thinking, who knows, maybe AI will help us overcome the final challenges to developing fusion energy before vanquishing us with a fusion energy weapon.
Yeah, it will dangle that fusion power in front of our faces and then just be like, psych, yeah, I'm actually going to kill you all.
Yeah. To serve man, it's a cookbook. It'll be one of those situations.
Right.
Whenever fusion energy is up and running, it won't be soon enough to solve our climate crisis, unfortunately. That said, it might become a key energy source in the second half of the 21st century. So if we're somehow able to use other renewable energy sources to keep climate change under control for the next few decades, fusion might make the road beyond that a lot smoother. That might be an optimistic timeline since some experts aren't as sure. Ian Chapman, the CEO of the UK's Atomic Energy Authority, points out that, quote, there is not today a single project underway to build a fusion power plant that will produce energy, end quote. Astrophysicist Paul Sutter, writing for the website space.com, puts the odds this way, quote, a 10% chance in the next 20 years, a 50% chance in the next century, a 30% chance within the next 100 years after that, and a 10% chance of it never happening, end quote. In explaining why he thinks it might take another century, Sutter reminds us about a fateful choice we already made not so long ago about how to invest our dollars. Quote, in the mid-20th century, when we had the opportunity to spend a generation's worth of time and money in the direction of nuclear research, we had a choice between bombs and power plants, and we chose bombs, end quote. In a newly dangerous post-Cold War world of authoritarian powers like Russia and China vying with the United States for geopolitical supremacy, who's to say we won't make the same choice again? As for me, I'm not so skeptical as to repeat that old joke that fusion is and always will be the energy of the future. I think you and I may live long enough to see most of the science and technology challenges overcome, but probably not long enough to see commercial fusion energy become part of the global energy grid. As an eminent Soviet fusion scientist once put it, the world will have nuclear fusion when it decides it needs it. That sounds about right to me, and it reminds me of the timeline for action on climate change. After dilly-dallying for decades, we're seeing the ravages of climate change made plain in our personal lives, right in front of our faces. And you can just sense that the world is pivoting and finally getting its act in gear. When the public realizes that fusion is an important part of the carbon-free power grid, we will get fusion power, but not a minute before that. What do you think, Mark?
I have to say I'm more skeptical than you are. And that's just, this is an uncommon orientation for the two of us, because usually I am the technology optimist and you are on the other issue.
Yes.
But what you took me through today makes me feel like this might be a unsolvable problem, because we're talking about research that started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So 50 to 75 years of human history have reached us to the point where we're thinking it might take another 100 years. That sounds to me like a problem that's just too hard for us. And yeah, there's always the AI thing that you can have in the back pocket. Like once AI gets better, then it will help us solve the problem. That could in fact be, because that has the potential of finding solutions that human intelligence cannot. So that's kind of the trump card to all of this. But if it's humans continuing to work on the problem, I could see them working for another 100 years and then think, well, it's probably going to take another 100. And at the end of that century, they're going to think, yeah, probably another 100 years will do it. And that can will just keep getting kicked down the road because the challenge is just too high. I feel like this is something that eludes us because the challenge of creating a sustainable, economically viable model that approximates the center of the sun is just too hard for us.
Well, your skepticism is understandable, and as I shared at the end, there are people who agree with you. But I think that my sense is that if there is a consensus, or a plurality maybe is a better way of putting it, the plurality is in favor of the quicker timeline, of it happening sometime mid-century. So that's one thing. But also I feel like humans move when there's compelling reason to, and there's an unbelievable promise in fusion energy of clean, carbon-free energy that will solve our global energy problems without destroying the world. That's the one thing. And then the peril, the pole, the twin poles, promise and peril. The peril of a world racked by climate change where the effects are really coming home to roost. And there are climate refugees, as we discussed recently. People tend to get off the dime, get off their asses, and do the work necessary to innovate when the consequences are right there in front of their faces. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, but all of that would assume that this is, in fact, a solvable problem. There's an analogy that I've been using for years to talk about the limits of human intelligence, which is, I have a dog. She's a smart dog. She's a good dog. I would never be able to teach calculus to her because calculus eludes a dog's understanding.
Right.
And I feel like we as human beings, there's a certain arrogance to humanity where we think any problem is solvable if we just have enough gumption to do it. If we put the money and the minds together, we will solve this thing. And for most of human history, that's been true, but we increasingly have run into scenarios where there are things that few human beings are capable of understanding, truly understanding. And I'm convinced that there are things that elude human understanding, not because they don't exist, but because our minds just are not constructed in such a way as to overcome them. And so when I look for an example of something that is just too hard for human beings to solve, I would say it's probably something that we would work on and work on and work on for decades, and it would always seem further away. And that sure sounds like fusion power to me right now. It's something that we've been working on for 75 years, and it's still at least 50 years away and maybe centuries away. So again, I agree with you that where there's a will, there's a way, and will, when it is marshaled, can accomplish great things. But again, underpinning that would have to be a solvable problem. And no amount of will or funding or passion directed towards an unsolvable problem is going to solve the thing that we simply cannot solve.
Yeah, I mean, having just recited a half hour's worth of facts and figures about how friggin' hard this is, I am not going to refute what you just said, which very well may be the case. I just want to push back a little bit, though. Like, you are more of the techno-utopian about AI than I am. Mm-hmm. And we haven't discussed, what is our AI partner in the best case scenario in Sam Altman's fever dreams, right? We have a partner in AI that's helping us do hard things. Isn't this the kind of thing we're going to point AI at? And who the hell knows what AI might be capable of in helping us to solve engineering and technology problems? It seems to me that's exactly what it's designed for, in the best case scenario. Right. That's one thing. We haven't even discussed that. That may very well get us over the proverbial hump.
Yeah, superhuman AI would solve all sorts of problems for us, one of which could well be fusion power. I totally agree with that. However, superhuman AGI is in itself a hypothetical product that no one has been able to prove will ever exist. There are optimists there and there are pessimists there.
Yeah.
So I would agree. I am in the pocket of superhuman AGI. If we achieve that within our lifetime, then I think a whole lot of things that seem difficult to impossible will suddenly start showing up on the horizon. So yes, AI trumps everything.
Yeah.
Because that solves the intelligence limit problem.
Right.
If this is too hard for humans to solve, it might not be a problem at all for some artificial intelligence that surpasses human capabilities.
Right.
But what I have to add to that is that AGI itself is a very difficult problem to solve, and there are people within the field who think it's impossible. So it's just sort of you're setting one potential impossibility against another. And I personally think that AGI will be achieved at some point. So in that sense, I'm an optimist, but I do not know on what time frame we're talking about that.
Yes, granted. But then secondly, my final parting thought here is, you know, in the 1950s, early 1960s, no one imagined that we were going to put a man on the moon. And then we just did it. The world rolled up its sleeves and did it. And the unimaginable became true in an unbelievably short time frame, like a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am a cockeyed optimist here. I do think that humans are capable of incredible things. But as I said at the end, we're going to get those incredible things not a minute before we realize how important it is. And I don't think human beings truly understand how important it is to get fusion up and running ASAP so that we don't end up choking to death and dying of heat exposure on a climate-destroyed planet.
Right.
But that realization is kicking in. Once we make those connections, we're going to get to work on these projects, and it'll be the moonshot of the 21st century.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I also hope that we do not make that moonshot contingent on bringing good jobs to our communities, because at the end of the day, employment figures should not be a significant factor in determining the future of something that could have such foundational impact on the future of the human race.
Yes, or worse yet, we're so focused on the fusion bomb, the new fusion drone weapon, that we're not going to use it for electricity or prioritize electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So, All right, well, that's kind of a downer ending, but that's kind of the lay of the land in fusion research right now.
Yeah, well, a big part of my life, stemming from when I was a teenager to present day, is a sequence of disappointed expectations where I would be reading when I was 14 or 15, novels about us having personal spacecraft that we would take out to the moon for lunch, and then realizing at some point later in life, that's probably not happening in my lifetime. Yeah. So just add fusion power to the list. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe I will be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. I have a question for you for next time.
Okay. Lay it on me.
All right. During our episode about how men aren't going to college in the same numbers as women, remember that one?
Sure.
College is for girls. That's episode 47. You and I touched briefly on some issues faced by boys and young men that might explain their college avoidance. Well, I don't know if you remember this, but we agreed to put a pin in that for a potential future episode of Mansplaining. I want to return to that now because I've been reading and hearing a lot recently about how there's an epidemic of loneliness among boys. One researcher on this topic wrote, quote, "Under patriarchy, boys and men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, human connection," end quote. I was going to ask you about that question, Mark. But then I read an article last week about a new CDC study tracking what appears to be an epidemic of sadness among girls. And I decided that my question shouldn't be limited to one sex. So here's the question, Mark. Why are young people so sad and lonely?
Okay. That's a big one. I'll dive into that, and I hope not to be sad and lonely for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah. But notice I kept it at one question. I could have added, and what can we do to ameliorate the situation? Right. But frankly, I'm less interested in solutions. I want to know what's the cause. Why an epidemic of loneliness and sadness? That's what I'm interested in.
Okay. Well, I'll see what I can find.
Thank you.
I already know that some people are going to say it's all social media's fault. But
Sure.
we'll see if maybe there are some other things going on.
Yes.
Okay, so that's it for this week. If you would like to follow up on any of Joe's sources and do some reading of your own, learn about fusion and, maybe add your thoughts to the discourse around that, you can find all of those on our Facebook group, which is called Mansplaining the Podcast. Joe will post his sources there. You can like it. You can add comments. You can ask questions. We really appreciate when people connect with us.
And I'll put that GAO report as the first source, because that's really the Rosetta Stone, or was for me, for understanding this issue.
Great. If you would like to help other people discover this podcast, and if you're a regular listener, you know what I'm about to say, but maybe you're a first-time listener, and so this is news for you. You can help us out by leaving us a rating or a review on your podcast player of choice. We're on all of the major podcast platforms. Leave us a rating, leave us a review, help other people discover Mansplaining the Podcast. If you have a question for us, or if you have something that you have to say and you don't want to post it to Facebook, maybe you're not on Facebook, then you can leave it for us as a voicemail. That number is 206-486-4074. If you leave a question, we will even feature your voice asking the question in the episode where we answer that question. So, exciting opportunity for you to become part of the podcast universe. Or, you could just leave a message talking about how you just cannot stand the sound of my voice. I've heard it before, but, I can take it.
Well, that was a message I left, though, so it wasn't from a viewer.
Yes, you left it in a fake German accent, but I could tell that it was you. But that's it for now. Thank you for spending your time with us. That was Joe, and I'm Mark, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you soon.
Fusion's hot, just like me. Fusion's strong, indubitably. Fusion vaporize is all we see. You best not mess with fusion. Fusion, light up the sky. Harness the power, let's give it a try. Energy to burn, no need to deny. But be careful with that fusion, oh my, oh my. Fusion's uncontrollable without a key. Fusion's nuclear, like my family. Fusion merges atoms, it's elementary. Best not mess with fusion. Fusion, light up the sky. Harness the power, let's give it a try. Energy to burn, no need to deny. But be careful with that fusion, oh my, oh my. In the core of the sun, where it all began, atoms dance to a cosmic plan. We dream of a world where it's in our hand, yet for now, it's beyond our command. Fusion, light up the sky. Harness the power, let's give it a try. Energy to burn, no need to deny. But be careful with that fusion, oh my, oh my.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.